It's funny how two little letters can come to represent so much. RS. They just sit so comfortably next to each other, both in the alphabet and on the rump of a car, particularly when that car is a Porsche 911.
I've been very excited about driving this ever since I saw it unveiled. And finally, it's here. And we're on the roads around the Nürburgring. Sadly, the weather's not entirely with us, but at least we get to find out what it's like in the wet. Let's talk about the colour of this car to start with, because it's the first thing you notice when you walk up to it. Guards red, perfect. I love the decals down the side. I'm not sure about the knacker ducts and the nose for brake cooling, but that rear wing, it looks so aggressive. You park it next to a GT3 and suddenly the GT3 looks shy and retiring. And the satin Aurus wheels, gold to you and me, they look just amazing on this car. They really set it off. I hadn't thought that a gold leaf Lotus colour scheme on this would work, but boy does it.
As good as the exterior looks, this car is actually a slightly curious spec. With no Club Sport package, let alone the Weissach pack, it is in something of a touring spec. No roll cage, and leather replacing the Alcantara on the wheel and gear selector. It's even got a reversing camera for crying out loud. It seems a little odd if I'm honest. If you want an RS, then surely you want that full, serious race car for the road feel. Perhaps that's just me.
So it looks fantastic, but what are the differences to the driving experience really? Because on paper, this car isn't wildly different to the one that went before in many ways. You know, 0-60 is only a tenth faster, power is up by just 20 brake horsepower, it's up to 513 brake horsepower now, 347 pounds-foot of torque, in case you're interested. Well, the differences come down to two main things. Firstly, we've got that engine, the 4-litre engine, now running to 9,000 RPM. We've experienced it in the standard GT3 and it is just magnificent. The fixed valve train in it, it's got so much torque, so you can really enjoy it all the time, even when you're right up on the top. It's just brilliant. I love that hauling from low revs out of a hairpin like that. You get different noises and all sorts of different revs in this engine. And that's what makes it so much more interesting than a turbocharged engine. The second thing is the chassis. We've got stiffer springs all round and rose jointed suspension, and the whole car just feels so direct. It's been said for ages now that 911s feel less and less rear-engined, and yes, that certainly is the case a bit. On these wet roads you still get a bit of understeer, you still feel that rear-engine balance, but now the way this gets into corners is just so instant at the front end, and the rear feels more playful. It feels like it wants to be involved much more, and of course that's what helps it get in. They've retuned the rear wheel steering on this as well. We've got the standard steel brakes on this car, 380mm discs. They are absolutely brilliant. They just match the directness of the rest of the car. And you can really lean on with such confidence. There's no slack in the pedal travel at all. You lean deep into them, triggering the ABS, and they just give you huge confidence. Even in the wet, it feels so agile. All the responses, the wonderful response to that naturally aspirated engine is obviously so crisp. The PDK has always been brilliant. I'm sure they've sped it up even more. But the fact it's so smooth, but it feels just a little bit more interesting to me. The shifts now, you get some of the sounds as though it's a race sequential really, a sort of pneumatically or hydraulically actuated race sequential, some of the futs on the change. And I do love that whole road racer vibe. There's just something so exciting about it. What better place to drive a road racer than an old racing circuit that's now a road. Luckily, there is just such a thing right on our doorstep.
Everybody has heard of the Nordschleife. In fact, that's what people instantly think of when you say Nürburgring. But as well as the North Loop, there also used to be a South Loop. And what's more, it was arguably even more terrifying. At 4.8 miles or 7.7 kilometres, the Sudschleife wasn't as long, but it was fast, and some say the track limits were even more marginal. And when I say marginal, I mean lethal. The Sudschleife was actually built before the Nordschleife, and the elevation profile would look very simple as you plunge downhill for the first half to the village of Mullenbach before climbing steeply back up for the return leg. It's appropriate that we're in a Porsche too, as the only time the German GP was held on this circuit in 1960, it was dominated by Porsches, thanks to being run to F2 regulations. Today, if you imagine travelling down the pit straight of the main GP circuit just as you do in a VLN race, but instead of turning right at the bottom, turning left, this is where the Sudschleife went. There is now a public road which describes pretty much exactly the same path through the trees, and it is easy to see why it was feared, because you can feel the gathering momentum. Names like Brankekopf and Siefken must have struck fear into most drivers' hearts, although not all drivers.
I remember asking Hans Stuck about the Sudschleife because he raced on it. Did he like it? I said. Yeah, he loved it apparently. And he's slightly insane. He said he loved the first part of the lap because it was just so quick, all being downhill. And it's so narrow, it gives you an impression of what the Nordschleife was like back in the day, even more dangerous, as if that's possible. And this is all that remains of the mighty Mullenbach corner, the 90-degree right-hander that signalled not only the lowest point of the Sudschleife, but of the Nürburgring in general. And as you can see, it's more prone to the vagaries of the weather. Now, well, there's just some scrappy land behind a fence where the circuit once would have been. This is as far as you can actually drive on the old Sudschleife. You can still walk a little bit further up the hill.
Occasionally the Nord and Sudschleife were combined into one huge 17.5 mile circuit called the Gesamtstrecke. It was on this that an incredible 84-hour race called the Marathon de la Route was run. The last of these was in 1970, and there was a clean sweep of the podium for, yes, you guessed it, Porsche, with Gerard Leroux, Helmut Marko and Claude Haldy taking the win in 9.146. But just 1 year later, the Sudschleife was no more.
And this is all that's left of the return uphill leg. I say all that's left. Main road's over there, so in some ways there's more than the downhill stretch. This is now just an access road to the Grand Prix circuit, or the Ersatzring, as I've heard some people cruelly call it. It's every bit as steep uphill as the downhill stretch is downhill. It's a bit like a sort of extended run up to Hoacht, in the same way that that was like an extended run down to the Foxhole. It's rather beautiful, if a little poignant. They used to say that there were ghosts and spirits living in the trees around this circuit because, I think, of the weather being so cruel on this half of it. Now, well, the circuit itself is something of a ghost. But as sad in some ways as it is that it doesn't exist anymore, we should just be grateful that the Nordschleife still exists. Talking of which, I think it's about time we went and had a go on it.
I think it's fair to say that turning up to the Nordschleife's car park with a brand new GT3 RS is just about the most rockstar thing I have ever done. Everyone wanted to have a look, which made heading out onto the rather slippery track even more nerve-wracking.
It's just such a brilliant place. Now being followed by a previous generation car, which is slightly intimidating. So excuses out of the way first. If you want to watch a proper lap of the Nürburgring in a GT3 RS, go and find the one that Kevin Estre did, because this won't be anywhere near that quick.
The Nordschleife was on typically capricious form and not having driven a lap there for a few years, it felt even more intimidating than normal, particularly with huge amounts of slippery pollen waiting to trip you up if you went offline. But the car was sensational. You could tell that this is where it belongs. It inspires confidence, and it's incredible how hard you can lean on all that typical 911 traction. You really can feel the big 325 section rears digging for grip. And the wonderful thing is that even at sub-estrus speeds, you still feel involved, and you can obviously still enjoy the glorious soundtrack. Probably won't surprise you to hear that this is a wonderful car. Perhaps it doesn't feel like there is such a big gap between this and a standard GT3 like there was with the first generation, hence the need, in my opinion, for full Weissach pack with the magnesium wheels, etc., for that really differentiating track refugee vibe. But the latest RS certainly hasn't let the Rennsport moniker down. Those two little letters, R and S, still give you goosebumps.